and welcome to Speaking with Sonnet. So today we're going to be talking to Miss Morris about Portia, who is the female heroine from The Merchant of Venice, and there's lots of different ways that you can interpret Portia. So we're going to start off by looking at her obviously at the start. Now she is portrayed at the start in some ways as being a conventional and typical Shakespearean woman, and do remember at that time they would be controlled by their fathers, and then after their fathers, if their father died, their brothers, and then they would be passed on to their husbands. So they're very much objectified.
Yeah, and it's funny because Shakespeare's always aware of these stereotypes and he always plays to them. So in fact the first line he has Portia say is, "My little body is aweary of this great world," as if she's kind of, the character herself is overly aware of her role in this particular world that she's living in, this society.
Yeah, and she goes on to say, "O me, the word choose, I may neither choose who I would nor refuse who I dislike. So is the will of a living daughter curbed by the will of a dead father." So she's following conventions there in a way because as a woman she is being controlled, manipulated by her father. Unconventionally he's dead, but he still has that control over her.
Yeah, I think it just shows how far a man's power can go.
Yeah.
Even beyond the grave, he's still able to control a woman.
Yeah, but there is an element of things being unconventional in the fact that she's actually expressing to Nerissa that she is annoyed by this, isn't she?
Which I think is really important with everything you look at in this play, to bear in mind that this is a comedy.
Yeah.
And so Shakespeare's going to be exaggerating everything he does. So a man having more power than a woman, that would have been quite funny that even from the grave he has more power.
Yeah.
A woman complaining would have been a little bit unheard of,
Yeah.
and therefore maybe quite funny.
Yeah, and also there is this kind of seriousness as well of these two women, so Portia and Jessica, both being controlled by their fathers. Actually, Portia is the one who is rich, she's got the money, she actually comes across as being very clever later on in the play, and she is the one really who toes the line by continuing to respect her father's wishes and by marrying Bassanio, whereas Jessica is the one who completely disregards her father's will and runs away with Lorenzo. So there's that parallel.
Yeah, definitely. But it's funny that it comes across that way because obviously Jessica is a Jewish family and therefore she's the villain, the bad guy, and Portia would have been the Christian, so she would have been the good guy. But it's funny because she manages to, even though she's got these strict rules but set out by her father, she still manages to fiddle with the casket test and make it work for herself.
So we'll go on to that in a minute. Something else that she then says, which is quite relevant, is the fact that she says that she would not particularly like to marry Morocco because he was black. So there's that element of racism and inherent racism that at that time would be far more acceptable than it is now.
And again, maybe even funny. So she, the quote she uses is, he has the complexion of a devil.
Yeah, and then he says, "Mislike me not for my complexion," which is on page 33. So in a way, there's that kind of awareness that he has that he will be disliked by Portia because of his complexion. And she was just upholding stereotypical values at that time of racism, wasn't she?
No, but it's funny, with modern eyes we read that and she becomes a villain of sorts to us because she's racist, and that kind of represents everything we think is bad in our modern day society, but it wouldn't have been read in that way at all, and that's important to bear in mind, I think.
Yeah, they would have thought it was funny and humorous.
Yeah.
And I think Morocco would have become a figure of fun because he says, "I would do this for you and that for you," and she's like, "I just wish I didn't have to marry you because you're black, you're a devil."
Yeah.
Isn't she? So then as the casket scene goes on, we'll talk about that bit where Bassanio comes in.
But it all goes to add more empathy towards, or more pathos for the character of Portia. So the audience are watching her go through these trials with these different men, and more they feel sorry for her because these men are so ridiculous. You know, the thought of going out with marrying a black man is so ridiculous. The thought of being with the Prince of Aragon, you know, he's such a ridiculous character.
And she, at the start, there's all of those princes and people who have come to court her, and she's like, well, he drinks too much and he likes horses too much, and so. But don't you think at that time that was quite unusual for a woman to be so dismissive of people who were likely to court her?
Yeah, definitely. Especially, they're all powerful men, obviously. Yeah. They've all gathered there because they're powerful men, and she's just disregarding them.
But it goes, you know, without saying that they want her because she's been left rich.
Yeah, and that's important to note as well. I mean, it's not something that Portia says, but it's said about her that she is a lady who is richly left.
Yeah.
And many Jasons come in quest of her.
Yeah.
So it's like, people only want her because she's richly left.
Yeah.
People only want her because she's like a prize, and because there's that element of competition and they want to win her.
Yeah. So now we're going on to the relationship between Bassanio and Portia. Now, there are lots of different ways to look at this. There's this idea that they're both very much in love with her. She's seen him before, hasn't she? She really likes him. He says, oh, I want to borrow money from my best friend Antonio to go and see her. However, we tend to think of the alternative and reading with these two, which is that Bassanio is a gold digger and he's lost all of his money through sort of just being fast with it. And he says to Antonio, if you give me the money to go and win Portia, then I'll be able to pay you back. So it's almost as if he wants to marry Portia to pay off a debt to Antonio.
It's like a business transaction.
Yeah, and then she, on the other hand, we have sort of like come to the agreement that she wants to marry him because he is easy to manipulate. And obviously during that time, if a man was to marry a woman, everything that the woman had became the man's. So in actual fact, the way that we look at it, which I think is a really nice way of looking at it, is that Portia knows that she can manipulate Bassanio and therefore she wants to marry him, so she retains her power. Yeah,
and actually it's funny because when he chooses the correct casket and she calls him her lord, I can't remember the direct quote, but she says that he has everything I own is now yours. Again, it's like that exaggeration that Shakespeare's giving the point, he's really driving the point that she's giving everything to him. But I think what's brilliant about that is that we don't see until later, the payoff comes later with the ring scene, that perhaps all along she's been quite manipulative.
Yeah.
And like you said, she wanted him to choose the correct casket because he was the lesser of all the evils, the easiest to manipulate.
So on page 85, and I'm not going to attempt to sing this all about it says the way that we think that in the way that she's able to manipulate him is to say, tell me where is fancy bred, or in the heart or in the head, how begot, how nourished. So this is a little song that comes just before Bassanio actually chooses a casket, and there's that element of her rhyming those words with lead. So you can, and again, these are just interpretations, you can interpret it that she's able to manipulate Bassanio right from the start, from that kind of the first courting.
And there's a nice way of thinking, one interpretation is that he wasn't aware of that, he's just so easy to manipulate and he just kind of picked up on it subliminally. But obviously another interpretation is that he has picked up on that on purpose, and this is her kind of sneaky way of getting around her father's will.
The curbing of her will, So she's like, I know which ones don't have my picture in it, so now...
But either way, that's quite clever of her, and that makes, I think, the audience kind of maybe fear her a little bit, like what potential, but also quite... Modern audience especially, we feel quite proud of her that she's able to overpower a man like that.
Exactly. So through sort of implicit means, she's been able to overcome this thing that was making her so unhappy at the start, which was her father saying you can't marry who you want to. And also she can't refuse, so she can't even say no if she hates somebody.
Exactly. But I was just saying it's like good for a modern audience, but obviously we've got to bear in mind that Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, and she would have, as a powerful woman herself,
she didn't marry.
She would have loved to see something, like that reflected in theatre, which arguably is why Shakespeare put Portia in.
So if we just go to the idea of the court scene.
Yeah.
Because there's loads of dramatic irony in the court scene. So do you just want to say what you think about the court scene?
About the idea of her sort of saving the day, but
also what happens between Bassanio and Antonio, because there is that element. So they basically say how much they love each other in the court scene when Bassanio is like, oh, I love you, and then Antonio says, tell your wife that you had a lover once, and then Bassanio says, I have a wife and I would sacrifice her to save your life. Now Portia hears all of this, doesn't she? So there's that dramatic irony where she's just married this man, and already he has left her and gone back to somewhere where he is proclaiming in front of the whole of the society of Venice that he loves Antonio and he would sacrifice Portia. Now there is that idea that this turns her against Antonio and it hardens her to Bassanio as well, isn't it?
Which is that perhaps why she draws out the clause that she's found in the bond? That's quite a nice idea. The fact that she knew all along she was coming to save the day. She knew she had the answer to the bond and how to get Antonio out of it. But she draws it right out, doesn't she? She lets Shylock believe for a while that he's going to win. Maybe because she's now quite bitter and angry about what Bassanio and Antonio have just said. So she wants them to suffer a little bit more.
And do you know what? I don't know if a modern audience, I don't know, maybe if this was to be written today, at that point Portia would fail.
On purpose.
On purpose. Because she's been
alternative ending, I like
embarrassed.
it.
She's been completely embarrassed by her husband.
Yeah.
And actually, nowadays, I think that we would think in the law, the eyes of the law, let Shylock have his bond because of the Christians,
Yeah.
you know, this horrible anti-Semitic behaviour. He is within his rights, isn't he?
Yeah.
Within the law to do it.
But I love that idea that she's this woman scorned and she's angry with what she's heard. And then that goes on obviously to the ring scene, to the ring plot line.
Yeah.
Where she's so annoyed, she takes the ring from Bassanio when he offers her some kind of payment.
And also what's interesting here again is the fact that Bassanio says you're not having it, and Portia goes, oh, all right. And then she like trots off. And then Antonio says, let him have the ring. Let his deservings and my love withal be valued against your wife's commandment. So what Antonio is saying there is, look, Balthazar has saved my life. Let the ring have it. It's more important that you thank Balthazar.
Yeah, but therefore belittling his promise that he made to Portia and his relationship with Portia.
And also Antonio does that in the court scene, doesn't he? He's quite happy to say in front of everyone, I love you.
Yes, he's undermining it.
He's undermining the sanctity of the marriage, which at that time would be far more important, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The marriage between Bassanio and Portia is likely to have been, you know, something that's much more important to the play, isn't it?
Yeah, but again, I find it's so easy for us to read this play as a tragedy and take it so seriously, but we have to bear in mind whenever we analyse this play that it's a comedy.
Exactly.
And all of this would have been taken with a pinch of salt. And all
so
of
they'd
this
have been
would
like, the audience would be like, oh,
yes,
well, you don't know, and ho, ho, ho.
Whereas right now, we're looking at it like, oh my God, that's actually a really terrible thing to do and say.
But the dramatic irony would have been comedic. Wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, but he doesn't know that that's Portia.
And and these things can be exaggerated, like going back to the song that's played.
Yeah.
We don't know if in Shakespeare's time, when that song was played on the stage, if he went, tell me where is fancy bread, and the whole audience would have laughed because they'd be in on this joke.
Absolutely.
And, you know, Bassanio could have acted a bit of a fool. And so I guess that leads into a point where it's quite important to see these plays performed and not just read on the page.
And also performed in the context of the globe during that time, when the villainy of Shylock would have been so heightened as a dramatic technique and a dramatic device.
I think just staying on that area of the play before we move on to the final thing, it's interesting how Portia is so willing to leave Shylock with nothing. Like, she has her character, she has absolutely no sympathy for him whatsoever. Like, I was saying earlier that she built up Antonio and let him think that he was going to die, and that was cruel, but it was also very cruel to let Shylock think that he was going to win, and then pull the rug from under him.
And what's happening is these men are being completely manipulated by a woman, which during the Shakespearean times, that would be so unusual. Wouldn't it? It would be sort of like, wow, this is something that we don't see. I mean, you have a queen on the throne, but it's not something that you would expect to see.
Well, the way I always describe it to my classes is it would have been like seeing a dog walking on its hind legs. It's kind of like, oh, that's unusual and quite funny.
Yeah.
But it's also quite rare, and you
would have thought a woman would do that. And so I think that's right, because the court scene is such a climax to the whole of the play. Added in this sort of gender, this woman who is able to manipulate and play all the men. I think that's something that, you know, we really need to focus on. The idea that would have added an extra dimension to the play that maybe we don't really conceive, you know, as a modern audience. No. We're just like, well, women can do that. What's the big thing? Whereas the fact that she was playing this man, would have made it even more like,
exactly.
Oh my God.
Exactly. But then again, don't forget, that would even heighten, I know I keep going on about it, but that would heighten the comedy even more, because it's a man dressed as a woman dressed as a man. So before she even starts speaking, it's funny. Yeah. You know, and then she'll be put on a funny voice, and they'll be gone, won't they?
Yeah. Because I think we can take it quite seriously now, because of the, you know, we live in such a society where we wouldn't tolerate this sort of stuff, and to actually find this entertaining. It's so repulsive. But during the Shakespearean time, it would be, you know, go. So we'll just talk about the last bit, which is the end, because there's obviously different interpretations to this. Being a comedy, everything ends happily. Obviously not for Shylock, but the audience would not have cared about that. The couples are together, the lovers are together, everyone's married and everyone's happy. apart from
apart from Shylock, of course,
and Antonio.
But I love the idea. Miss Wells went to see a performance of this, and she told me this, and it stayed with me because one of the interpretations was that at the end, nobody, after the whole rings, the ring thing is revealed, and Portia says, I was the lawyer, I have the ring. Actually, everyone's really cross with one another, and everyone kind of feels really like they've been hurt. And so actually it ends with everybody just gradually walking off the stage one by one.
Which is more realistic, really,
yeah.
isn't it?
And I love that because that's exactly how I would have reacted if I found out my husband was willing to just give away something that I told him not to, or if I was Bassanio and I found that my husband was just trying to trick me. I would be annoyed, whoever I was. So I think that's a much more realistic ending. But obviously Shakespeare was writing a comedy.
Yes, everyone was like wildly in love, but there is this element of Portia still regaining control in some ways. If you have a look at what she says to Antonio, so she says to him,
well, I was thinking his response, he can't say anything, he just says, I am dumb, which means I'm speechless.
Yeah, and she says, unseal this letter soon, you shall find that 3 of your Argosies are richly come to harbour suddenly. So this element that his ships have been recovered, but she doesn't explain how, and they've come suddenly, and the interpretation could be that she has, with all her vast wealth, managed to replace his ships, and the reason that she does this is then it forms a break in the friendship between Antonio and Bassanio, and he can go back to Venice, and she is left with Bassanio, because there again this would kind of lead to the element of her cruelty, wouldn't it, and her power. So she's breaking up these two people who do remember have embarrassed her somewhat in the court scene by declaring their love for each other.
But also she's completely taken the control by doing that, and even if you look at her language, she's sort of direct address, and she gives lots of imperative verbs like unseal this letter. She's telling him what to do. She's suddenly now got the power, and it's almost like you can imagine they're both fighting over Bassanio. He's the sort of the piece of rope in the middle between them, and she's now finally at the end. She's got him, and Antonio's dumb. He can't, I'm speechless. He can't.
And also she says this to him. She says, Antonio, you are welcome, and I have better news in store for you. And again, what she's doing is she's not allowing Antonio to speak at that particular time, which would be very unconventional. She is holding forth. She has the longest utterance. She is the one who is tying up the loose ends. And again, as a woman, to end a play with her being so elevated in terms of power would be quite unusual. And I think, again, we don't probably see the comedy, but oh, look, her indoors is like the powerful one.
I love this because if you look at the graphology, like you were just saying, she has more airtime. She has that whole long speech when no one interrupts her, and then these are just kind of bitty. The other male characters only get a little bit.
They're
so
like,
you can, so you can tell just by looking at the page that she's holding all of the power.
Yes. So there is that ability, if you were to interpret this as Portia being, cruel.
Yeah.
The cruelty between Bassanio, or the alternative is you could say that what she's doing is she's reasserting her power in her house, where she has actually been the one who has suffered because she's been so embarrassed, and she's been taken for a ride by this man who basically only wanted to marry her to pay his best friend off.
Yeah. Or, I wouldn't offer this as the only interpretation if you're going to, but it might be worth mentioning it as a possible interpretation. Perhaps she just is so head over heels in love with Bassanio, and she wanted to help him out and his friend out.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's just actually a love story.
Yeah. So, that is one way. Yeah. Yeah. So, it is a comedy, and at that time it would have been a love story.
Yeah.
It would very much have been a romantic love story, and Shylock was just a bit collateral, wasn't he? Anyway, thank you very much for listening. This is Miss Morris. I am Miss Sonnet, and our producer is Mr. Lavington. So thank you very much.